So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this educational session. I hope it will be informative. There's probably a lot of stuff I'm going to fill you in on that you have learned and you know about, and so hopefully some new things too that you'll say, oh, gee, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that. So last night's session, which was done by my colleague, Danny Stein, focused on the situation here, the security situation and the war going on here in Israel and with our neighbors in Gaza. Tonight, I might touch on that tangentially because I'm going to go back in time to the early years of the state of Israel. And the big topic tonight is different reactions to the Six-Day War in June 1967. However, you'll see that it is related to what's going on today, particularly with the conflict with Hamas in Gaza. So one of the things, one of the remarks I like to say about the Arab-Israeli conflict is Israel has fought a war every decade of its existence, but in some ways, the wars that we fight are all part of the same conflict, right? They're just the next chapter in the same conflict. And we can argue amongst ourselves, when did this conflict start? In 1948? Or did it start in 1917 when the British issued the Balfour Declaration? Did it start in the 1880s with the first wave of modern Zionist Aliyah and the beginning of the modern Zionist movement? So historians and scholars will debate that. I'm not going to go into those questions today, but I'm going to really kind of zoom in on what happened in 1967 and some of the reactions. So let me just share my screen with you for a moment, because I want to give you an overview of the things I'm going to talk about as we go forward. Okay, so screen share. All right, so you all know about the Six-Day War. You all know that it was a tremendous upheaval in the history of the state of Israel, in the Middle East, and really the entire world. There's a lot of different reactions to it we could talk about. I'm going to focus on 6 different groups and their reactions to the upheaval of the Six-Day War in June 1967. First off, I'm going to talk about Israeli society. And no surprises, the reactions are not homogeneous, right? There's many different groups within Israeli Jewish society, and they interpreted Israel's victory differently. So we'll talk about that a lot. I will talk about the American Jewish community, right? The Six-Day War had a big effect on how American Jews viewed Israel. The other really big Jewish community in the world at that time were the Jews living in the Soviet Union, who were quite different in their Jewish identity than Jews in the United States. So we'll talk about that too, how it affected them. Of course, we'll talk about the reactions in the Arab world, particularly in Egypt and Syria and Jordan, but especially Egypt. The Six-Day War had a monumental impact on the U.S.-Israel relationship, right? I just said a minute ago that, when the Iron Dome is at work protecting our skies, those are your American tax dollars at work, kind of. So it wasn't always like that. The Six-Day War had a big impact. And finally, I'll touch upon what the quote, international community expects Israel to do, and expects Israel and the Palestinians, what they expect us to do since 1967. I'll focus on the United Nations, but basically it's the same viewpoint that the U.S. State Department has and the European Union. I just call it kind of generically the international community. Okay, so hopefully we'll get into all those different aspects. But what I want to do is start with a song. So all the teachers at AMHSI, we had a big meeting today to talk about curriculum, and we all teach the same curriculum, but we each do it according to our talents in our own ways, right? We each have our strengths. So I'm into music, and I like bringing songs to class, and almost every class that we do at our school has a song that's appropriate that goes with it. So I'm going to start by playing you a song, and I'm pretty sure you're all going to recognize this song. And of course, it became very, very famous with the Six-Day War. All right, I have to remember to optimize for video and sound. Okay, so here we go, and I will share my screen with you too. I got a video for it. All right. Can you guys all hear the sound okay there? Right. So you all, I'm sure, recognize that song, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. And it became kind of an anthem of the Six-Day War. The famous songwriter who wrote it, Naomi Shemer, she's not singing it. The woman singing its name is Shuli Natan. She's a famous folk singer. But Naomi Shemer wrote that to be kind of a sad song because, as many of you know, before the Six-Day War broke out, Yerushalayim was a divided city, right down the middle between Israel and Jordan for 2 decades. And the lyrics of the song were quite sad about how we can't go down to Jericho, we can't go to all these places because that we could before 1948 because they're now in Jordan. And the song became very famous. And of course, what happened is within a few weeks after the Six-Day War, Naomi Shemer had to add another verse to make it a happy song and say, well, now we can go down by the way of Jericho. She had to change the lyrics to reflect the reality of the change. So that's what I wanted to start with. I wanted to start with the reactions in Israel to the Six-Day War. Some of you, I can't, a lot of your cameras are off, but some of you might have been like alive at that time in 1967. I was not, okay? I came along a decade later. But I did hear a lot about the events of the Six-Day War from my parents and from my grandparents, people in my family who lived through it, right? For them, it wasn't, some distant past. It was history they lived through. All right, someone remarked that they were 10 years old. So you probably, if you were 10 years old, you probably have memories of that, okay? I think I remember world events when I was 10 years old, like, President Reagan. So I think if you have questions, right, you can put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them kind of at the end. So what I want to start out with is to give you the feeling in the country before the Six-Day War, right? Because whenever you talk about the Six-Day War, usually we just jump to Israel's victory and this euphoria. But it wasn't like that in May and the beginning of June of 1967. It was a very, very scary time. In fact, they called it in Hebrew the hamtanah, the waiting for something terrible to happen. And many people at the time, when they looked at Egypt and Syria, which were combining their armies under one military command and getting ready to go to war against us, there was a fear there was going to be another Holocaust. There was a fear that there was going to be another war that would last for years, like the War of Independence. Okay, you should understand that in Israel's War of Independence, 1948, 1949, 1% of the entire Jewish population of the country lost their life. Right, that was a staggeringly high number. So I want to read to you a speech by Ron Hudai. Today, Ron Hudai is the mayor of Tel Aviv. He's been the mayor of Tel Aviv a long time, but he was a young pilot in the Air Force in 1967. And I personally translated this speech because I thought it was so moving. Okay, he talks about the fear in the country. So this is what he writes. Dear friends, wars break out as a surprise. In 1967, as we celebrated Independence Day, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and entered Sinai. I remember well the atmosphere in the country in the days before the outbreak of the Six-Day War, what we called the Hamtanah, days of fear and anxiety. At my kibbutz, Hulda, one member actually left for Germany, ironically, out of fear of a second Holocaust. During this time period, they were expanding cemeteries, already digging new graves, and in some places they were taking parks and ordering them to be turned into cemeteries because they were anticipating tens of thousands of casualties, if not more. And so the euphoria that came about because of Israel's victory, right? We have to understand that before that, there was this feeling that maybe the country was going to be wiped off the map. That wasn't hyperbole. President Nasser of Egypt was saying this in his speeches, that we're going to throw the Jews into the sea. So I just want to share with you, if any of you guys are interested in these topics, I want to recommend a great website for Jewish educators and Jewish education. It's called Unpacked for Educators. I'm sure some of you know about it, and they have great podcasts. I want to share some of their clips of their videos, and you'll see some of the footage from this time period, but I want you to get a feeling of the understanding of how dire the situation was and how people were expecting a terrible, terrible tragedy to occur. So let me share here, and I'll press play.
The week of May 14th, 1967. On May 11th, the United Nations had condemned Arab attacks on Israel as deplorable and menaces to peace. But rather than calming the situation, Arab states were about to escalate the conflict. On May 14th, Egypt's President Nasser began moving his troops and armor into the Sinai Peninsula, the only buffer zone between Egypt and Israel. Since the 1956 Suez War, this area had already been demilitarized with UN troops stationed along the Egypt-Israel border to help maintain the peace. Nasser's initial decision to move troops and armor into Sinai was in part fueled by false information supplied by the Soviet Union, Egypt's ally and sponsor, that claimed Israel was about to invade Syria. Within a day, Nasser learned that the claim was false, but chose to continue with the military buildup threatening Israel. On May 16th, goaded on by other Arab countries and the Egyptian public, and urged to not, quote, hide behind UN skirts, Nasser ordered the UN troops to immediately evacuate the Sinai. To the bewilderment of the international community, the UN acquiesced and simply left. Israel now lay exposed on its southern border as Egypt continued amassing its troops in the Sinai. By the end of the week, Egypt had moved 80,000 troops, 550 tanks, and 1,000 artillery pieces towards the Israeli border. On May 18th, government-controlled Cairo radio made Egypt's intentions clear.
As of today, there no longer exists an international emergency force to protect Israel. The sole method we shall apply against Israel is a total war, which will result in the extermination of Zionist existence.
War seemed inevitable.
Okay, so there's a lot of history there that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Again, you can go to Unpacked for Educators, or you can YouTube that too. But it's fascinating I still get chills even today going back and looking at this, and I can't believe what our neighboring countries were saying, right? Especially today, we have a peace treaty with Egypt. It's hard for me to comprehend that for the first 3 decades of Israel's existence, Egypt and Jordan and Syria were trying to annihilate us. I wasn't alive then, so I've only heard more and more testimonies about what it was like in the country and the fear. So now you get a sense why the main reaction in Israeli society was a tremendous sense of joy and euphoria and tremendous victory. So to show you the feeling, not just in Israel, but amongst the entire Jewish community worldwide, I want to show you a few clips from a monumental, I guess, a documentary movie called The Prime Ministers. It's based on a fantastic book called The Prime Ministers by Yehuda Avner, who was an advisor to Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin and Menachem Begin. And he wrote a whole book about all his encounters with history. And he talks a lot here about the incredible feeling of Jewish unity and relief and joy at the moment when Jerusalem became a unified city in June 1967. So I'm going to share that with you now for just a couple of minutes so you can see for yourself.
And within a few hours came what in the Israeli folklore is a declaration that has entered the pantheon of Israeli triumph. Those were the words communicated over the radios by Colonel Motogor, the commander of the parachutist brigade. Har HaBayit Beyadenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. I had been instructed meantime to fly to the United Nations, to be at hand for Abba Eban, who was then addressing the Security Council. But I wouldn't leave without first of all seeing the Western Wall. I knew the chief army spokesman in Jerusalem, and through his good officers, a military jeep took me through Lions Gate. And inside was pandemonium. Soldiers of every stripe and of every rank were rushing through the alleyways to see the Western Wall, just a touch. And I was privileged to look at it. I couldn't get anywhere near it before I flew off to the UN. And here it must be stressed, this was the first time since the destruction of the temple in the year 70 AD that one of its major constructions that remained was back in the hands of the Jewish people. Would the old city have been a priority within the confines of the Battle of Jerusalem had it not been for Begin? It was this sense of history and mission, the mission that it inspired. And he spelled it out in the cabinet meeting.
All right, I want to stop there. I think Yehuda Avner expresses it really well. Said he was not going to go fulfill his mission and go to the UN without first going to see and pray at the Kotel. You might have noticed the prayer plaza looks a lot different in that video than it does today, right? There was a neighborhood of houses going up to it. It was not the broad plaza that you know of today. For those of you who have been to the Western Wall, you had something very, very rare in June 1967. You had a moment of complete Jewish unity, right? And if you look at the thousands of years of history of the Jewish people, right? I mean, the entire Talmud is the recording of all the Jews arguing all the time, and to have this incredible moment where the entire world, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, religious and secular, Jews in Israel, Jews in the diaspora, everyone coming together with this one unified relief and joy of seeing for the first time in almost 2,000 years Jerusalem come under Jewish sovereignty. So for those of you who are alive and remember it, you don't need me to tell you that. I wish I could have, witnessed that, something in history that I would have loved to have seen. But it's in my collective memory. As the Jewish people, that they say Jews don't have history, we have memory. So it's in my collective memory, this incredible moment. And of course, that unity wasn't to stay that way. A few days, even a few weeks later, you already started to get this divisiveness about what to do with all the territory. So I want to talk about first the reaction of Israeli society, which is not uniform. There were all kinds of different reactions. I want to take you through some of them. But they're all quite fascinating, and all these reactions still exist to this day. These arguments, we're still arguing about this, 56 years later. Okay, so of course you saw this famous picture of the paratroopers at Sanchanim at the Western Wall. These guys are all still alive. They're in their 70s now. Every year in the anniversary on Yom Yerushalayim, on Jerusalem Day, these guys get back together. I think the guy in the middle is a physician, and one of the guy owns like a grocery store, and the other guy I think drives a taxi, if I remember correctly. And you can see them, of course, kind of trying to redo the pose. So let me skip down for a second and talk about, well, who are the leaders of the country at the time? The Labor Party, right? If you've been following Israeli politics in the last, 20 years, the Labor Party has not been doing well, but they were still the big party, the socialist left-wing party in Israel for many years. Some of these faces you might recognize: Moshe Dayan, Yigal Alon. The prime minister at the time was Levi Eshkol, and no surprise, they didn't agree what to do with all these territories. So Moshe Dayan, I don't know if I'm paraphrasing this, it might be more of a midrash, but it was said about him in the summer of 1967 that he had this kind of quote that he would say, "I'm sitting in my office and I'm waiting for my phone to ring. And I'm waiting for the Arab leaders to call me and to say they want to begin negotiations," right? Basically, he was a big war hero. He was the Minister of Defense, right? He had previously been the Chief of Staff of the Army. And his whole point of view was that we had defeated our enemies in such an overwhelming fashion that they're never gonna go to war against us again, right? That they're eventually going to come around to our existence, and they're eventually, at some point, they're going to come to the negotiation table, and we're going to learn how to live in coexistence. Yigal Alon didn't necessarily think that. Okay, so he put forth actually a plan, because his consideration wasn't just security; it was also demographics. So let me show you this famous map here. It's called the Alon Plan. Okay, I have no relation to Yigal Alon, but he was a minister in the government, and he put forth this plan that he thought it would be in Israel's interest to maintain complete control and sovereignty over what's called the Jordan Valley. Okay, meaning the eastern side, the eastern border of the state of Israel, as it is today. To prevent any further invasion of an army coming from the east, crossing over the Jordan River. But he also considered demographics to be important. His definition of a Jewish state was a state with an overwhelming Jewish majority. And he thought that annexing, for example, what we call the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, which had previously been in Jordan, he thought that was a bad idea, right? That we don't want to control a very large Palestinian Arab population. It's going to change our demographics. So he put this plan forth called the Alon Plan, and it never ever got voted on, right? It was basically just kind of put in a drawer or in a cabinet, and Moshe Dayan basically ignored it. And Yigal Alon, you can understand his disappointment. He had this idea of how to improve the situation. The prime minister, Eshkol, he actually died in office in 1969, and he was succeeded by Golda Meir. So we don't know if he would have come around a couple of years later to Yigal Alon's plan. What I want to do is I want to read a couple of statements from both from Moshe Dayan and from David Ben-Gurion, who was still alive then. So this is what Moshe Dayan said in 1969. About the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel was holding at the time, right? He said that Israel must retain possession of Sinai and Sharm el-Sheikh, the strong point guarding the entrance to the Straits of the Red Sea. He goes on to quote, "I prefer to sit in Sharm el-Sheikh without peace than have peace and return Sharm el-Sheikh to Egyptian hands." So basically, he was kind of being a hardliner. He didn't feel that the Arabs, who were being backed and armed by the Soviet Union, that this was the time really to make peace, that he didn't trust that they had come around to it. Now, Ben-Gurion, on the other hand, he died in 1973, so he was still alive. He was kind of the elder statesman. He had moved down south to the Negev desert to a kibbutz. But in 1971, this is from, I believe, the New York Times, he was quoted as saying, Israel's first prime minister urges withdrawal from the territories captured in 1967. Okay, the article said, he's quoted as saying, "Peace, real peace, is now the great necessity for us. It is worth almost any sacrifice. To get it, we must return to the borders before 1967. If I were still prime minister, I would announce that we are prepared to give back all the territory occupied in the Six-Day War, except East Jerusalem." And he goes on to say, "Sinai, Sharm el-Sheikh, Gaza, the West Bank, let them go. peace is more important than real estate. We don't need territory. With proper irrigation, we now have enough land right here in the Negev desert to care for all the Jews in the world if they come. So you have a big difference of opinion between Moshe Dayan, Yigal Alon, Ben Gurion. As I mentioned, the Prime Minister Eshkol died in 1969 and Golda Meir succeeded him. So no surprise that moment of unity was short-lived. I want to take you through some of these kind of points of view here. Make this a little bigger. All right, so one point of view, this is kind of, I would say, the left-wing point of view. People were saying we must leave the territories immediately, right? Capturing land by war is illegal by international standards. This will only upset our neighbors. What will we do with another million Arabs in the territories that don't want us, right? We can't give them citizenship. If we do, Israel will no longer be a Jewish state. So one of their big criteria for what to do with the territories was demographics, right? The left wing, right, more the far left wing point of view, they were basically saying we don't need to hold on to these territories. And the definition of a Jewish state is a state in which the overwhelming majority of the population is Jewish. Those who were more moderate had this point of view, right? So this is kind of what Moshe Dayan was saying. We must hold on to the territories in the meantime and then trade them back in exchange for peace. Many of you know who Shimon Peres is. This was his opinion back in 1967, right? He changed his thinking as the years went on, but this is what Peres and Moshe Dayan thought in 67. The territories are important for military purposes, for security, by giving us defensible borders. In the meantime, our Arab neighbors have declared they do not want peace, right? So we have to have this defensible territory, right? Eventually, the Arabs will come around, they'll ask for peace, and they then will give back the territory, right? They're holding on to the territory as a bargaining chip, right? With control of the territories, it's easier for the Israeli army to control a potentially hostile Arab population. Okay, and then you basically have the right-wing point of view, which not just people who were religious held this point of view. There were people who were right-wing and secular, right? Like Menachem Begin, for example, right? Who were saying we must annex these territories to Israel. They are our historical homeland. We have every right to settle them, keep them, right? The Arabs lost these lands in a war that they started, right? We have a national, religious, historic duty to settle and build Jewish towns and villages in our ancient homeland, right? They don't call it the West Bank. They call it Judea and Samaria. Only by capitalizing on our victory will the Arabs eventually realize that we are here to stay. And strength, right? That is the way to peace. All right, so no surprise. There was no consensus, not in the government, not among right-wing and left-wing. Yigal Alon's plan was never put into action. Gaza, of course, you see on the map here. I often ponder this thought. What would have happened in 1967 if Israel just said, we're going to redeploy the Israeli army and we're going to leave a 10 or 20 kilometer strip of land in the northern Sinai connecting Egypt proper to the Gaza Strip to create territorial contiguity. And we're just going to give the whole thing, we're going to give Gaza back to Egypt, right? Egypt controlled Gaza from 1948 to 1967. Would the situation look different today if we had simply returned it to Egypt? Now, there's another side to that whole issue, and that is it's not just Egypt. The Arab countries were being funded and armed, of course, by the Soviet Union. So handing that territory back to Egypt would have set up basically the Soviet Union, Russia, would have been breathing right down our necks had we relinquished that territory back in 1967. So there's a lot of considerations that I don't just like to play, Monday morning quarterback and, well, we could have or should have done this. Nobody could have imagined the Hamas terror organization in 1967. Although Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was created in the 1930s, but we couldn't imagine the situation as we have it today, right? So it's hard to judge the leaders back then for their decisions. I do want to talk about another huge reaction in Israeli society, and that's religious Zionism. Here, let me stop sharing my screen for a second. I think all of you know Birkat Hamazon, right? Or a lot of you do. In Israel, a lot of religious Zionists add a Harachaman, right? There's many Harachamans, right? God the Merciful, that you could, little blessings that you could add in Birkat Hamazon. So a lot of religious Zionists will add the following paragraph. I'll recite it, sing it for you. It goes like this. Harachaman, hu yivarech et medinat Yisrael, reshit tzmichat geulatenu. That means, blessed is God the Merciful, who blesses the state of Israel, which is the first phase of the redemption of the Jewish people, the first phase of the coming of the Mashiach. All right, so to understand this better, I want to take you back to a story in the Bible. You probably know the story of the Battle of Jericho, right? The Israelites have finished wandering in the desert for 40 years, and they enter the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua, Yehoshua. And our first enemies that we encounter is the city of Jericho. And in the book of Joshua, it describes the conquest of the city of Jericho by the Israelites, that God tells Joshua to organize the Israelite army and to have them encircle the city of Jericho and march around it 7 times and blow the shofar and scream. And then God makes the walls of Jericho fall down. And when I studied the Bible and I studied Tanakh, we had this interesting concept called double reasoning. That is, what is the miracle in the Battle of Jericho? And so someone who's more of a religious person will say, well, this is God. God intervened and brought down the walls of Jericho, right? And someone who's not a religious person, is more secular, will say, oh, it was the might of the Israelites, okay? Another example that you know about in Jewish history is the Hanukkah story. Okay, the original Hanukkah story doesn't mention a vessel of oil. Right, the original Hanukkah story is about the victory of the Maccabees over the Seleucid Greeks. And then many centuries later, the rabbis in the Talmud rewrote the story, and they centered the story around the miracle of oil, and that they came and they restored the temple in Jerusalem, and they found one vessel of oil that it lasted for 8 days. And the miracle in that story is God's miracle, right? And so you have all these different times in Jewish history where the point of view is it a miracle from God, or is it a miracle that we did through our strength and our courage and our determination and leadership? And so here, let me go back to sharing the screen here. I want to give you this famous quote that you might have heard from Ben Gurion. David Ben Gurion was known to say, to be a Zionist, one must believe in miracles. So what miracle is he exactly talking about? Sometimes you hear Israel's victory in the War of Independence referred to as a modern miracle. And similarly, Israel's stunning victory in the Six-Day War in 1967 is called a modern miracle. Of course, everyone interprets that phrase differently. Those Jews who are secular Zionists, their definition of a modern miracle is we secured a victory and triumph through our strength, through our determination, our leadership, our ingenuity, our motivation. Whereas religious Zionists, although they believe those characteristics, religious Zionists believe these victories to be from God, right? This is God intervening in history. God is playing God's hand. It's God who brought us this victory. And so religious Zionism went through a tremendous transformation because of the victory of the Six-Day War. You might have heard of some of these names. Tzvi Yehuda Kook was one of the great leaders of the religious Zionist movement, right? The movement, one of the elements of that movement was to build Jewish communities over the Green Line in the areas of Judea and Samaria, or what is known geographically as the West Bank. Similarly, Eliezer Waldman was a critical figure in the movement to build Jewish communities over the Green Line in the heart of the biblical homeland. Tzvi Yehuda's Kook father, his father was Rabbi Abraham Yitzhak Cohen Kook, simply known as Rav Kook, who was the founder of religious Zionism, right? And this idea that the secular state of Israel and secular Zionists, they're actually an instrument of God, right? That they are doing God's work even if they're not religiously observant. So religious Zionist leaders saw the victory in 1967 as a mandate to basically go out and to start to build Jewish communities over the Green Line. I want to share with you some videos about this here that I have that talk about the ideological commitment to building Jewish communities, or what are often called, depending on your politics, settlements in the West Bank. So here, there's a couple of videos here. I'm not going to take you through all of them, but they'll explain the ideology really well. Okay, so share sound and video. Okay, here we go. This will tell you a little bit about religious Zionism.
The land of the West Bank was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Also known by the biblical names of Judea and Samaria, it had remained central to Jews around the world and had maintained a continuous Jewish presence for 3,000 years until the War of 1948. Beginning in 1948, when Jordan captured the West Bank and eastern Jerusalem, Jews were expelled from the region and were not allowed to access the Jewish quarter of the Old City, the Western Wall, or other Jewish holy sites.
All right, I'm just going to switch to a different video. Here it is. Okay, let's try this one. Also, this is also quite informative. Stay with me.
Those who viewed these territories as vital for security, as being won in a defensive war, as having a deep historical Jewish connection, and as having had no previous Palestinian Arab sovereignty, those people viewed the word occupation to be way off base. So, with the land in Israel's hands and Arab rejection of any negotiations for peace, new developments began. For a long time, Zionism's pioneering spirit of settling the land had been secular. But now, there was a new frontier, and one with so much religious significance in the heartland of the biblical homeland. Soon, a new group of religious Zionist pioneers would take the helm. Through them, the settler movement would be infused with and fueled by religious passion and faith. Many religious Jews saw this as a historic moment they couldn't possibly ignore. The dawn of the Jewish return after long exile described by the ancient prophets. But this settlement movement was still going strong too, and the first place they chose to resettle was Kfar Etzion in the Judean hills. The Jewish community of Kfar Etzion had been massacred in the War of 1948. The settlers arriving now in 1967 were the children of those who had been massacred. They were literally returning home to the place where many of them had been born. Meanwhile, the religious settlement movement continued to grow, and in 1974 formed a political entity known as Gush Emonim, or the Bloc of the Faithful. Fueled by the newfound pride of being able to live in all of their ancient homeland and brimming with euphoric hope, Gush Emonim continued to settle communities in Judea and Samaria. But in the words of author Daniel Gordis, there was a sense that the conquest was more complicated than the euphoria suggested. We'll explore these complications in later episodes, starting with a crucial question. What exactly is the Jewish connection to the land that has fueled the settlement movement, and why does it seem to hold so much influence?
All right, so I'll stop there because the settlements are something you hear about in the news all the time. And I'm not here to take an opinion one way or the other. Some of you might come from the left side of the spectrum. Some of you might come from more of the right side of the spectrum. I'm not here to take a point of view on that, but what I do want to suggest, the next time you guys come to Israel, to get a better understanding of this issue, I want to encourage and recommend to all of you that you visit the Kfar Etzion Visitor Center. The story of Gush Etzion is really interesting, right? It was basically the Jordanian army slaughtered and massacred the residents of Kfar Etzion in 1948, and the survivors and their children came back in 67, right? Once Israel took control of that territory. So remember that. It's called the Kfar Etzion Visitor Center. Next time you're in Israel, it's worth a visit. It's really interesting. You know, it'll tell the story much better than I can in just that little video. So hopefully what I did now in the last couple of minutes is I was able to explain to you the diversity of views in Jewish Israeli society. Okay, I didn't even get to the other points of view yet. But the arguments that you see today, maybe you were following the protest movement that was going on this year. A lot of these divisions in Israeli society, of course, they have their roots going back to the years after the Six-Day War, right, in 1967 onwards. Okay, so of course, religious Zionism went through a tremendous change as a result of the Six-Day War. Basically, it really ignited this movement called Gush Emunim, right? And this drive to build communities over the Green Line, right? On the land that Israel took control of post 1967. So here's what I was saying before. Reishit Smichad Geulatenu, right? They believed that Jewish settlement in all of the greater land of Israel was Reishit Smichad Geulatenu, that it was the first phase of the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people, the Geulah, the coming of the Messiah, right? So that became a very, very important part of their ideology. So today, like I was saying, the religious Zionism is a very, very ideologically committed group in Israel today. The men wear a knitted kippah. They all serve in the Israeli army. And they don't call the West Bank the West Bank, which is a geographic term, right? The West Bank of the Jordan River. They use the biblical names, Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria. And they trace, right, the tribal, or if you go back to the Bible, the tribal allotments in the book of Joshua, right, many of them were in what is today the West Bank. So what is this area called today? It depends on your politics, right? As I was saying, Judea and Samaria, Yehuda v'Shomron, over the Green Line, the 67 borders, right? The West Bank. So some people who are more moderate and just don't want to use those terms will say the territories, or in Hebrew, hashtachim, the 67 borders. If you're curious, you can YouTube this. There was a meeting in the White House in 2011 when Netanyahu met with President Obama, and he stared at him. He said, "Mr. President, Israel cannot go back to the 67 borders because they're indefensible." He had a very uneasy look on his face at the time when Obama was hearing Netanyahu say that. You can look it up on YouTube. Just type in Obama, Netanyahu, White House, 2011, 67 borders, and you can see that whole press conference. It's quite interesting. Okay, so the next topic I want to address, and again, some of you might be old enough to remember this, how did this affect American Jews? Okay, so as you recall, I was saying before that the fear that there's going to be another Holocaust, that wasn't just in Israel, that was the fear amongst American Jews. There was still a tremendous feeling of guilt among American Jews because of the Holocaust. And that many American Jews had families that were murdered in the Holocaust, and that just by pure luck and good fortune of being in the US and not in Europe, that their lives were spared. So it's now more than 20 years later, and there's this feeling there's going to be a terrible disaster again. The Six-Day War had a huge effect on how American Jews viewed Israel. Okay, so let me show you this famous picture. Maybe you can spot some of the people in that picture. Okay, so the most obvious person you can obviously see is Martin Luther King marching in Selma, Alabama. What is there a Sefer Torah doing in the middle of this picture? So the guy on your right is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a very, very famous philosopher, rabbi, theologian, one of the most prominent American Jews at that time. And the guy in the middle is Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, who was the president of the UAHC, which today is the Union for Reform Judaism. And they were there marching with him. What does this picture tell you? In the 1950s and 1960s, what was one of the biggest thing on the agenda for liberal American Jews? It wasn't Israel, right? It was things like civil rights, Vietnam, nuclear disarmament, basically what we call tikkun olam, right? I remember my Jewish education, tikkun olam was like a very big component of my Jewish education, right? I grew up in the Reform movement, a Reform synagogue, Reform camp. Everything was always about tikkun olam. We learned about Israel too, but tikkun olam was front and center. So what did the Six-Day War do? The Six-Day War, it changed the place for Israel on the agenda of American Jews. Right now, right, this is, I think, from Norfolk, Virginia, this newspaper in 1967, right? Now, all of a sudden, there was a sense of common destiny between American Jews and Israel. And now Israel became more or less the #1 item on the political agenda for American Jews, right? Today, all of you have heard of AIPAC, right? And today, maybe at least once a year, more than that, right? The Prime Minister of Israel comes to Washington and is hosted by the President of the United States. And you're used to seeing these things. This past summer, the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog, was invited to address a joint session of the U.S. Congress. And you're used to that, right? You're not surprised by that. It wasn't always like that. So the Six-Day War truly had a huge impact on American Jews and how American Jews viewed Israel and where they were giving their money to. Now, on the other side of that, you had Jews in the Soviet Union. So I want to highly recommend this book, although I don't think it's in print anymore. You have to order it. It's called The Jews of Silence. Elie Wiesel wrote this book in 1965. Of course, he also felt very, very guilty about the Holocaust. Elie Wiesel didn't speak about his experience in the Holocaust in Auschwitz for, I think, 10 years after the liberation, until he started to write and speak about it. But he wanted to make sure that never happened again. So Elie Wiesel, he went behind the Iron Curtain. He made a trip to the Soviet Union in 1965 to meet with Jews and to hear about their plight. So my take on it is that American Jews and Jews in the Soviet Union were mirror images of each other. American Jews had all the freedom they could ask for, religious freedom, not entirely free of anti-Semitism, but to live in a country where there wasn't going to be pogroms, where the government wasn't going to attack them, free to be Jews and to practice Judaism and to integrate into society. Whereas Jews in the Soviet Union were not allowed to be Jewish, outwardly, openly Jewish. They had to hide their Judaism, right? You could get arrested. The synagogues were shut down. They were forcibly assimilated, right? The Jews in the Soviet Union were forced to speak Russian and were forced to abandon Yiddish, as opposed to American Jews. That American Jews took on the English language out of their own desire to speak English. They weren't forced to. The Soviet Union, they were made to go to Russian schools and speak Russian. And basically, the Communist Party tried to erase their Jewish identity. So what did the Six-Day War have to do with all this? Elie Wiesel had to write another chapter in this book, in another version in 1967, because he went back to visit them after the Six-Day War. And he found out the Six-Day War had a tremendous impact on awakening of Jewish identity and Zionism amongst Russian Jews. Now, when are you going to see the effects of this? Not for about a quarter century later. As you all know, starting in the 1990s, around 1989, 1990, the Soviet Union allowed Jews to leave. And in the decade of the 1990s, Israel absorbed approximately 1 million Jews from the FSU, right, the former Soviet Union. I remember my own community when I was growing up, like I don't know if it was Passover or Thanksgiving, we had a Russian Jewish family that had just moved to the United States, and we were giving them clothes and stuff, and they were coming to, we're having them over for meals. But most of them went, of course, to Israel. I personally remember December 6th, 1987. I went with my family to something called Freedom Sunday in Washington, and I think maybe like 1 million people marched in Washington for the protesting for the release of Jews from the Soviet Union. One of the people who spoke there was Natan Sharansky, right? You may remember him as Anatoly Sharansky. That's him with his wife, Avital. And he was prisoner in the Soviet Union for years until finally international campaign, a lot of it led by American Jews, they campaigned for his release. So what does all this have to do with the Six-Day War? The Six-Day War ignited Jewish identity amongst Jews in the Soviet Union. It made them aware they were Jewish, even when the Communist Party tried to erase their identity. They couldn't do it. And so we see this today. For example, these are some very prominent politicians that you might recognize, right? Avigdor Lieberman, Yuli Edelstein was formerly the Speaker of the Knesset, Zev Elkin. I could go on and on and on. In every single place in Israel today, Russian Jews are leaders in every field, in science and technology and computers and the army and politics. It's an incredible, incredible thing. Today, 1 out of every 5 Jewish Israelis was either born in the Soviet Union or their parents were born in the Soviet Union. All over my town, I always hear Russians on the TV. So it had a huge, huge impact, right? And again, you can trace this back to the Six-Day War, right? Would there have been a revival of Zionism and Jewish identity amongst Jews in the Soviet Union without Israel's victory, right? And also keep in mind that the Russians were the ones who were funding and aiding and helping Egypt and Syria, right? And they were publishing all kinds of stories in the paper how Israel's, losing the war. So they had to see through all the communist propaganda as well. Tremendous story. Okay, so now having said all that, let's turn our attention to what was the reaction in the Arab world. Let me stop sharing my screen for a second. So many of you, of course, know the term Nakba, which applies to what happened in 1948. Right? There's no question that what we celebrate as a victory and the independence for the Jewish people, for a Jewish state, was a terrible tragedy for our Palestinian neighbors. Hundreds of Palestinian villages were depopulated for all kinds of reasons, not just for all, the anti-Israel propaganda will tell you that it was all the Israeli army. That's not true. There were some cases and instances where that happened, but for the most part, these were people who were fleeing a war. I remember when I was in college, in 1995, there was a gigantic quilt hanging from my student center. I thought it was the AIDS quilt. And I got closer and I kept seeing pictures of the Dome of the Rock and maps of Israel in Arabic, and it was all red, black, green, and white. And I went to ask them what this was. They said it's the Palestinian quilt. And each segment was a village that apparently was depopulated, that disappeared from the map because of the creation of Israel in 1948. 1967 was a tremendous humiliation, not just for the Palestinians, but for the entire Arab world. And it didn't lead to peace. So many of you have heard of the Six-Day War, you've heard of the Yom Kippur War, but there's another war in Israel's history called the Forgotten War that we don't talk about enough. I want to turn your attention to that now. And it's simply called, in Hebrew, Milchemet HaAtashah. It's called the War of Attrition. And what happened is between 1967 and 1970, Israel had to fortify its ceasefire line along the Suez Canal, right? And you had the Egyptian army on one side and the Israeli army on the other side, and the soldiers from the Israeli army who had to go down to the ceasefire line were sitting ducks, and the Egyptians were shooting at them, snipers, artillery, mortar shells, you name it. And this was going on for 3 years. More than 300 Israeli soldiers lost their lives in the War of Attrition between 1967 and 1970. Right, so the leaders right here, Milchemet HaAtashah. It's a great book about it in Hebrew by Yehuda Bril. So this is the map from the Yom Kippur War of October 73, but it shows you the demarcation. It shows you where the Israeli forces were sitting all along the Suez Canal, right, to prevent more aggression from Egypt. Now, the leaders in Egypt back then, as you know, right, you probably are familiar with Gamal Abdel Nasser. Well, he died in office in 1970, and Sadat, right, who ultimately, this is the leader who made peace with Israel in 1979, but he would go on to launch the Yom Kippur War. So Nasser, before he died, said, I don't care if it takes me 1 million lives, right? I can't defeat Israel now, but I can bring Israel to her knees. And basically, the Arab countries, what Moshe Dayan was expecting, but they're going to pick up the phone and call me and begin negotiations, that was not the case. And in fact, 2 months after the Six-Day War, in August 1967, the Arab countries had an organization called the Arab League, and they met in Khartoum, which is then in Sudan, and they issued the infamous, from Israel's point of view, the infamous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition with Israel, and no negotiations with Israel, right? At the same time that Moshe Dayan was saying, I'm expecting them to call me on the phone so we can start negotiations, the Arab countries clearly didn't want to do that. So I'm not going to talk about the Yom Kippur War today. That's a whole different topic. But we can see, right, and let me stop sharing my screen for a second. I've remarked to anyone who's asked me about it recently that there's all kinds of similarities between the colossal intelligence failure, what happened 1 month ago on October 7th, and the failure of Israeli intelligence on October the 6th, 1973, with the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War. So that's not really the topic of this discussion, but I will say if we're talking about reactions to victory in the Six-Day War, one of the things that we felt in Israeli society back then was a sense of overconfidence, arrogance, right? This attitude that we beat the Arabs so resoundingly and so overwhelmingly that they're never going to go to war with us again in a conventional way. And we were very, very wrong. So there you see some of the reaction of the Arab world. What else did I want to show you here? Okay, so this, I think you'll get a kick out of here. I wanted to show you some images from, I guess, both shared US and Israeli history. Another topic that's of interest is, how did the Six-Day War affect the US-Israel relationship? Okay, so a lot of people out there today have this notion that ever since 1948, the United States has been giving massive military financial aid to Israel, and that is actually not true. That's since 1967, right? Between 1948 and 1967, we didn't get anything, except with one little exception. There was weapons that were provided by the Kennedy administration, but really, the U.S. didn't get involved militarily with Israel in the early decades. And 1967 changed all that, and of course, we can't forget that this is in the middle of the Cold War, right? And since the USSR was arming and funding our enemies, the Arab countries, right, it was important, especially after 1967, and we were the winners, you know, that the United States needed to have their own ally in the Middle East, right? And think about the issues that are going on there: oil, the Suez Canal, and all the maritime traffic that's going through it, right? The U.S. is going to change its tune. So let me go back to this movie, right? Yehuda Avner's movie, and I'll show you how, for example, you're going to see Lyndon Johnson here meeting with Israel's Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, and how this relationship changed. All right, it completely revolutionized the U.S.-Israel relationship. So check out this scene.
Now we come to the next day when the talks began. The talks took place in the president's den. There were deep leather furniture and overstuffed cushions where you just sat down and then you went down and down and down. The president on a rocking chair, up there, up. And in order to communicate with him, you had to sit at the very edge of the couch. I mean, I could just see Eshkol now and his team. And the talks began.
The heart of my mission is how to create peace in the Middle East at a time when the Syrian and Egyptian armies are being rebuilt at a menacing rate under Soviet guidance. So fast that the Arab leaders are contemplating renewed war. In a word, Mr. President, we presently do not have the minimum means to defend ourselves.
So what are you asking for exactly? Spell it out.
I'm asking for your F-4 Phantom jets. Without those Phantoms, we will be deprived of our minimum security. We need 50 Phantoms as rapidly as possible.
50?
Within 2 years, our Arab neighbors will have 900 to 1,000 aircraft. So it's an either-or situation. Either the United States provides us with the arms we need, or you leave us to our fate. If I leave here empty-handed, the Arabs will know that it was not only the French who said no to us, but the Americans too. Mr. President, Israel is pleading for your help.
Plans won't radically change your realities. The big problem is how 2.5 million Jews can live in a sea of Arabs.
All right, so I'll leave it at that for a second, but you can see the dramatic moment there with Lyndon Johnson hosting at his Texas ranch, Levi Eshkol. This is, again, after the Six-Day War. Eshkol asked for 50 American Phantom jets, and you can see the drama of this moment. The Israel, that we depend on it, right? That we're not going to survive unless we get this military aid. Today, it's referred to as Israel's qualitative military edge. I mentioned to you, every time I hear the Iron Dome exploding in the sky over, my town, I say, "Oh, American tax dollars. Thank you very much." So you guys are paying to protect our skies. The Iron Dome, when it came out in 2008, 2009, was revolutionary, but it goes back a long, long time. former ambassador Yoram Ettinger said that it's not giving aid to Israel. He says the U.S. is investing in Israel, right? And Israel, as a lot of you know, takes that money that the U.S. gives us, and then we buy weapons that are manufactured by U.S. defense industries. So there is an element here of the military-industrial complex. But it's very, very clear that Israel would not survive in this neighborhood without that American aid. So it's very, very important. I said I wasn't going to talk about the Yom Kippur War, but I'll just mention in the middle of the Yom Kippur War, the United States sent in an emergency airlift of ammunition and guns and equipment and everything that we needed. Nixon, okay, in the same month, Nixon was recorded at the White House of saying something like, F the Jews, they don't vote for us anyway. And the same President Nixon also authorized an emergency airlift of all the weapons that we needed to be victorious in the Yom Kippur War. Okay, so this is a whole issue that you can trace on and on and on from every president since Johnson all the way today, all the way through Biden, right? As you saw immediately when Israel was forced to go to war in recent weeks, the first thing that Biden did is I'm asking for $14 billion, asking for this aid, the Congress. So you understand that there's a very, very important dynamic at play here. And all that came about because of the 6-day war. So I guess I got to finish up in a minute or two, but I want to show you a couple things here in conclusion. There's one thing I think I'll skip over. I was going to mention UN Security Council Resolution 242, but I think I'll save that for a different time. But basically, the international community expects this recipe of land for peace, right? That Israel, you're going to give back the territory that you captured in the 6-day war, and for full normalization. Okay, I do have one image here that's important. I want to show you with this. So let me share my screen one last time here. Okay, so here again, this is I think in 1963, John F. Kennedy and David Ben-Gurion, right before we were getting all this military aid. This is the exact scene you just saw, right? Lyndon Johnson is hosting Levi Eshkol on his ranch in 1967. Right, Nixon and Golda Meir. This is right around the time I was born, right? Gerald Ford. That's Yitzhak Rabin, by the way. People forget that he was prime minister in the 1970s too, 1974, 1977, right? He not just in the 1990s. He had a whole different term for 3 years in the 70s. That's Rabin and Gerald Ford. So look at this op-ed from the journalist Nicholas Kristof. This was from July of this year. Right, maybe some of you read it in the New York Times. He wrote an article. It's a very well-written article. I don't know if I agree with it, but I encourage you to read his article. It says, with Israel, it's time to start discussing the unmentionable. He didn't necessarily say in the most direct manner that immediately the U.S. should cut off all aid to Israel. But he said maybe Israel can defend itself now, and we don't need to be sending billions of dollars in aid to Israel annually. And of course, what I find the most interesting thing is to read the comments. When I read these articles, I think the articles like the Mishnah and the comments are like the Gemara, right? So until I get sick of it, I can't read it anymore. So you can read this article and see what his idea is. He won a couple Pulitzer Prizes, I think, this journalist. So and this was featured in the New York Times, right? Raising for discussion. Maybe it's time that the United States doesn't need to give all this aid. Again, you can form your own opinions about that issue. So when did Land for Peace work? You probably remember, some of you are old enough to remember this, the Camp David Accords, right? This is, you see here President Sadat of Egypt, President Carter and Menachem Begin. Sadat was the same leader of Egypt who launched the Yom Kippur War against us. And then a few years later, embarked on the path of peace. And that's a whole different discussion I'm not going to go into now, but remember what I said before, land for peace. Okay, in this scenario, Israel withdrew from the entire Sinai Peninsula, and we did get peace. Now, not a warm peace like the US and Canada, but a cold Middle Eastern peace, which is better than a hot war. When did it not work? Okay, you all remember this, right? September 13th, 1993, Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands with Yasser Arafat. And shortly after, we turned the Gaza Strip over to the Palestinian Authority and other population centers in the West Bank, right? Jericho. And then basically the idea was to create within 5 years a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. We know that didn't happen. Ultimately, Hamas came to power in 2007, and we know what they did. So here's an example of not land for peace, right? When Israel withdrew from Gaza, withdrew from these territories, and we got the opposite of peace. So in one scenario, land for peace worked well, and another scenario didn't work. And there's a whole lot to say about that, but I think I'm going to leave it there. So in summary, let me go back to the top here. Okay, these were the reactions I was trying to show you today, that there was not just this homogeneous reaction in Israeli society. You saw different points of view from left-wing, centrists, right-wing, religious Zionists. We talked about how the Six-Day War had a huge impact on American Jews and how it made Israel a huge item on the political agenda for American Jews. We talked about the Six-Day War, its impact on Jews in the Soviet Union and helping to rekindle their Jewish identity and their desire to ultimately leave and move to Israel. We talked about the rejectionism within the Arab world, the three no's, the war of attrition, and ultimately Israel let down its guard and we were attacked again in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War. You saw how the Six-Day War had a huge impact on the U.S.-Israel relationship, right? Whereas beforehand, we weren't getting a lot of military aid. Ever since then, we've been getting billions and billions of dollars annually. Thank you very much. And finally, right, the international community, in many respects, still believes that the whole conflict should be solved by land for peace, right? Some people still subscribe to that. Some people not so much. So hopefully I was able to give you guys kind of an overview of all these different reactions. I want to remind you, right, I'm going to turn over to Michael in a second, but join us tomorrow for another session, Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism on college campuses with my colleague Tal. Tal is amazing. Anyone who comes to that session, she's terrific. She is a really, really good educator. So I want to encourage you guys to come and see her as well. She teaches in the class right next door to me. Just saw her a few hours ago. So my final message for all of you. Toda rabah. Thank you very much, all of you, for taking the time out of your busy day to come to this educational session and to learn and be informed about what's going on here in Israel. And I think it's clear to all of you what happened in 1967 has a huge impact on what's happening today. So beyond thank you for coming here, I also, on behalf of all of Israelis, I want to thank all of you for everything that you're doing for Israel. I know every single person who came to this session that you guys are not just following the news, but you're donating money, you're active on social media, you're going in person to protests, maybe you're writing to your representatives and your leaders. And I want to thank you all for everything that you're doing. You're making a difference. And we're all hoping and praying that there will be peace and calm soon. I'm very grateful that the siren didn't go off in the middle of this whole session. I think we have to wrap it up, but if anyone wants to stay on, I'm happy to answer some questions. And I want to hand it over to Michael and say once again, thank you to the JNF for putting this together. Toda rabah.
Just thank you. Echoing David's sentiments, thank you all for joining us, and join again tomorrow for the anti-Semitism and Zionism on campuses. There's probably not a more important topic here in the United States right now as things are unfolding. And again, and also echoing David, go to jnf.org/support Israel for donating today. Everything goes right to the infrastructure of Israel to support Israel in the crisis today. And of course, tune in at 9 a.m. for the broadcast from Saul Lieserbraum with terrific guests on Israel every day.